Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Ravlick. Thank you for joining me for this particular podcast. One of the biggest issues that we've seen unfold in recent times with the COVID pandemic is the way in which uh, events that have been shut down, completely cut off when the guillotine came down in March. Theatres shut down, concert venues shut down, and more importantly, for some people in Australia, sport ceased to take place all over the shop. One of the people that will be joining me today with the podcast is Bill Woods. He's a sportscaster extraordinaire, I think you'd say. He's been around the traps predominantly in the past couple of decades with the 10 Network and also Sky News. Bill's got a lot of experience in the area, and he'd be able to give us some diagnosis of what the pandemic means for the way in which sport operates in Australia today. Bill, thanks for joining me.
G'day, Tom. Great to be with you, mate.
Thank you for coming along. Now, but before we go into the COVID stuff, there are people who won't necessarily know where you've come from in terms of your career. And and there are members of the audience of this podcast who are sitting in Germany and France and wherever have you, as well as Australia. What would your career look like on a couple of PowerPoint slides?
Oh, wow. That's quite complex, Tom, because unlike a lot of people today who have very fixed and strongly thought out career paths, I sort of let events carry me along. Bear in mind, those events began way back in the late 70s. So I graduated from university hoping to become a print journalist initially. And I did a brief radio course when the market was a little bit depressed. There were no cadetships around. And I was also, and still am to some degree, would you believe, very introverted when it comes to self-promotion. You might find that hard to believe, but it's a fact. So back then I was very shy and got a cadetship with a radio station as an announcer, not a journalist. And after 9 months to 12 months in the country of New South Wales, I got a Sydney newsroom cadetship. So a little bit later than some. I sort of took the long route, but I was in there doing all kinds of news reporting and presenting on radio. And then in 1989, I was picked up by the 10 Network as a sports reporter and presenter. And because at that time I'd been focusing on sport for my particular radio station. I'd not long covered Wimbledon and a few other big events. So then started 24 years with 10, doing just about everything except washing the car of the CEO, which I probably should have done or I'd still be there today. I was, you name it, I did it, writing, producing, commentating, mainly presenting. I guess I started to focus on presenting and interviewing and sort of those sort of programs towards the end. And I was a news anchor for 5 or 6 years at 5 o'clock. The alternative in New South Wales to say Steve Quartermain at the time in Melbourne. Quarters and I are still good mates today. And anyway, from there, I went on to do a variety of projects. Cut loose from 10, I sort of freelanced for a while doing talkback radio, drive time for TUE in Sydney, and a few other sports shows for 7, and more recently, as you said, for the Sky Channel, Fox Sports sort of umbrella. That's all cross-owned and cross-run, so it's too complicated to go into. But anyway, that's where I was until, again, being cut loose at the start of the year.
Now, one of the most fascinating discussions I've ever heard about motor racing actually took place while you were at 10 hosting the V8 Supercars panel. I think it was on a Sunday afternoon.
Yes, V8 Superstars, we called it. It was an interesting show.
Because and you'll understand why it appeals to my sense of forensics. The discussion was all about the parity between race teams and how you try and get to the point where the only element of contest, the only element that matters on that grid is the skill of the driver. And it was one of the most fascinating discussions I've ever heard.
Yes, and it's one that's just ongoing in motorsport. It's probably what turns off some sports fans when it comes to motorsport. I'm unique in that there's not a sport I haven't enjoyed watching and enjoy covering and devote time to. Most sports journos have a sport they don't particularly like, even if they don't admit it, and some they will publicly, denounce and make quite a good living out of doing that on a regular basis. Motorsport, I find absolutely fascinating. There are a lot of parallels with horse racing, in the sense of the industrial side of it, the business side of it, and the team aspect of it. But primarily, I've always been fascinated with driver versus driver. I'm not a mechanically minded person. I love cars and I love driving, and I certainly love racing. But I'm more into the personalities and the human factor. But it is an intrinsic and ongoing argument in motor racing as to what extent you let the technology and the use of it and the application of it dictate the results or the differences between teams. I've always been more inclined to try and achieve as much as of parity as possible. But technology's also allowed us to create variables within that. For example, with Formula One, where you've got you can change your aerodynamics mid-race and fuel consumption, all those things. That enables you to have a strategic perspective on the sport, and I think that's okay, providing everyone gets the same choices. But there are other aspects of Formula One that are inherently unfair, and that is, the amount of money spent on development and parts, etc. That's always going to be the problem with motor racing. Is this constant? How much do you allow the knowledge of technology to interfere with the driver-to-driver contest? And you could argue the two guys who suffered most from that would be Australians, Mark Webber and Daniel Ricciardo, who, had they been with top teams at the time, probably would have been world champions. And hopefully Daniel still could be. And that's the great difficulty with coming to terms with that kind of thing. But you know what? If you look at other sports, for example, AFL, rugby league, the wealthier teams, even though there are so many elements of parity built into the system, such as draft and salary cap and all these things, the wealthier teams still find a way to get an edge on the others. And even if it means recruiting the best people behind the scenes so that they attract better players to their club, et cetera, and all these other little mechanisms. So, yes, parity is an interesting discussion. We could go on forever.
You did, but just on what you said, it takes parity as a general concept. That is the contest between drivers, or the contest between tennis players, or the contest between athletes in track and field at the Olympics. The extent to which sports are clean, the extent to which technology, drug use, interferes with that. I mean, the concept of parity flows through the whole space of sport, doesn't it?
It's a great point. And you know what? As you were speaking, I was thinking, well, swimming, track and field, these are sports where you're getting as close as possible to parity. But then if you look at it a little more deeply, how about the kids from poor countries who don't have access to the best training facilities, the best training techniques, and the best equipment, whether it could be a pair of running shoes, for example, for a kid, if that's all they need. All these things must be factored in. Your social environment is a huge input into how well you become as an athlete. I grew up in a small country town on the far south coast of New South Wales. Wonderful. I wouldn't trade that upbringing for anything, other than the fact that I played a lot of sport as a kid. And apart from my own, inhibitions and other factors as an individual athlete, I know I was disadvantaged when I went to state contests, whether it was I was a swimmer and I was also a sprinter in track and field. And I remember, taking my bare feet to a track meet in Wollongong, and I was racing against kids in spikes. And so, yes, you're right. There are lots of environmental aspects that affect parity, even in the sports that appear to be totally pure. So, yeah, I find that all very fascinating. And it's, well, whether it's sport or business, as you would know better than I, whatever you can do to get an edge, you'll get it or take it.
Speaking of business and getting an edge and sort of taking the bull by the horns, uh, the sports sector's lost a lot of the capacity to do that over the past 3 to 4 months as a result of COVID. What have you noticed just in your general observations about the way in which the pandemic has hit the sporting world?
Wow. Interesting. It's first of all, I was very impressed with the collegiate approach taken by the NRL, which is probably no more than other sports, but notoriously fractured by factionalism and all sorts of other problems. But they did pull together very well, and I guess you've got to give Peter V'landys a rap for that. The AFL has done a very good job as well to sort of pull everything together and get it happening. But there are so many different angles, Tom, to what's been going on. One that you and I had discussed prior to this conversation was the whole concept of being in a hub or a bubble, whatever you want to call it, the camp mentality, and a couple of teams have been seriously disadvantaged. For example, the WA teams in the AFL, perhaps now the Victorian teams. Who knows? This is a fluid situation as we speak. And of course the famously the New Zealand Warriors in the NRL. The entire competition hinged on their ability to come to Australia and participate, and their willingness to sacrifice all the benefits of operating from home. And it's funny, but as you've mentioned, I'm old enough to go back a long way when there was an entirely different approach to team professional sport, where particularly male teams were seen to be better off in a hub or a bubble. The camp mentality has long been a tool used by coaches, for example, to isolate their team, create a sense of them against us, bond the team, particularly get them to be familiar with each other and comfortable with each other, and then unleash them on the field as a much more potent force. Back when Ricky Stewart, now coach of the Canberra Raiders, was coaching Cronulla, he had a serious problem with a loss of form. And a little bit against the grain, even at the time, he took them into a camp away from their families for a couple of weeks, on and off. And it worked quite well to turn their season around. That thinking's changed dramatically. We've seen in all fronts now a much greater sense of mental health for players. They're two words, by the way, that back when I was young, you'd never hear in a sentence relating to sport. Now, of course, it's a daily discussion. And so what they've found is that players need to be around their families. They need to be with their partners. They need to be with their kids, if that applies. They need to be with their parents or siblings. So these things have all been discovered with a lot more research and depth of interest. And I think I'm probably wrong, but one of the earliest recollections I can have of this mentality changing is when they started to allow partners to go with Australian cricket teams on overseas tours. Once upon a time, it was the great thing. The guys got to go away together. It was like the old sexist boys' own fishing trip and things like that. Now that's all been so debunked as an effective way of team performing, because the guys actually wanted to be with their families most times, and so yes, it's fascinating to see how these clubs and the players' associations particularly have been really resenting the idea of isolation and lockdown. And that's been a massive part of the conversation with getting all these things to work. That's just one of the many aspects of what's going on. There's a whole lot of other stuff here too. One particular thing that I'd like to discuss when I get an opportunity with a sporting forum is, in years to come, would you like to see an asterisk placed next to the various sporting seasons that have been affected by this COVID-19 shutdown? And goodness knows it may well go into next year too. Would you like to see that? Because I, as a Liverpool supporter, one of the many teams I support, would like to think that there shouldn't be an asterisk against the English Premier League, that Liverpool, despite the disruption to the season, were so far in front, they would be legitimate champions. And I think that's been proven on the resumption. However, there are many other sports, such as the NRL and the AFL, and as I've just explained, where teams have been seriously disadvantaged. So whoever wins those competitions, if you're a fan of that club, would you be content to see an asterisk next to it? What do you think?
Probably not. But if you're sitting there, but you might want to note that there's been something that happened from the point of view of history during the season that's impacted that particular premiership period, simply because it's a fact. There's been an impact. Sport's been knocked about.
Mm.
Whether it should undermine which you're saying, the prestige of winning a cup that year or not is I think, a separate and distinct question.
Yeah, I'm open-minded about it. I know if I was a fan of a particular club, I mean, look at the AFL ladder now, and you would think, wow, would you have thought that would be the ladder? I know it's early days, but given the disruption that's still to come, there's no doubt about that. I'm I'm thinking if one of these clubs that we didn't expect manages to jag the flag this season, it's going to be very interesting how people approach it. The other interesting thing is it hasn't greatly affected the rugby league competition, I think, apart from the Warriors, whose ability to win was questionable from the start anyway. That has very much formed into a competition of two halves. There are the haves and the have-nots. It's such a clear delineation this year, with maybe one or two exceptions around the middle of the competition. But the top 8 you see now in the NRL is probably what you're going to see at the end of it, which is most unusual. And that doesn't seem to have been affected greatly by the virus. So yes, it'll be interesting. You could argue perhaps that teams like the Storm, they've had so much disruption trying to get a camp and get themselves sorted out. But on the other hand, they are a club that has the best coach at the moment in the game, and is probably best able to handle it. Had it been another club, for example, New Zealand, that has its own share of problems anyway going into the lockdown or the bubble, it only opens up the wounds that are already there. So it's going to be interesting to see how this is judged in history.
There's something else, though. We've just spoken about sports administration. We've looked at the clubs. There's another there's something else that's missing when you're watching this particular re-emergence or reignition of the seasons, and that is the crowds in the stadiums. Now, how much do you think that's going to impact on the way in which the season plays out?
It's interesting. I get varying reports from players as to the atmospheric influence. That there's a long-held theory in rugby league that the crowd has an influence on referees, for example, in some of the most basic elements of policing the game. For example, keeping teams onside. The crowd does, tend to roar when a set is being played out and they see a team consistently offside. If it's the away team, they will let the referee know about it, and it's very hard if you're a referee not to be influenced by that. I don't know if umpires are as greatly influenced by an AFL crowd as referees are in these areas, because I don't know if there's any positional policing that is obvious to the crowd as there is in rugby league, keeping the teams apart, for example, as opposed to footy where it's, they're all in together. So the crowd's influence is an interesting one, and players, more importantly, I think the motivational side of things, that's often down to the individuals, and it brings us to how well prepared a team can be and how much they rely on home crowd atmosphere. I mean, it's well documented over the years in all kinds of competitions all around the world. Some teams are particularly good at home, not so good away. That's an interesting development, and each team has its own personality too, Tom, from year to year. And it may only take a couple of changes in personnel, for example, to completely adjust the personality of that team to be a team that thrives on different factors. So all this stuff's very interesting conversation, and it's just being tossed around like never before. I've been to a couple of games, by the way. I'm sort of an ambassador for the Canterbury Bankstown Rugby League Club, so I host a corporate room at their home games whenever I can. And I've been to 2 games now without the crowd, with all the cardboard cutouts. And one thing I emphasise to the 50 odd people in the room who are all spaced out, it's very weird, is look, don't feel uncomfortable. Go out, follow all the rules, but enjoy something that hopefully is unique. Listen to the sound of the game without the crowd and enjoy it for what it is. It's like going to a park game when you're a kid and actually watching the best players in the world playing in your local park. So yeah, it's a very interesting time, and I must admit I have savoured my live footy with no sound other than the players calling out and the smack of bodies.
And that's the sort of thing that somebody sitting at home wouldn't even appreciate,
Mm.
right? Because if you're in the stadium, and it's been a while, I mean, I'm talking ages since I've even been to a live stadium gig for a music artist. Um, Almost embarrassed to say it's probably about 3 years now, but that's not a here nor there. It was actually Springsteen, by the way. The and it and that was almost 3.5 hours of absolute bliss.
Yeah.
But yeah, to be in a position where there's no other noise other than watching the game and you're focused on the technicality of the game being played, not just all of the people and the characters sitting around you. That's a completely different experience.
I found that I was conversing with the fans around me more than I probably normally would. Maybe that's to do with the absence of sound. I don't know. It also might be to do with, our team's not going very well at the moment. So there's a lot of soul searching going on. But it was interesting. We're all spaced, of course. I must emphasise that. But 1.5 to 2 meters, you can still talk to each other. It was interesting. It was like, I don't know how you describe it, Tom. Instead of say good example, it was like a Springsteen concert versus maybe a jazz band playing in a bar.
Oh,
It was like that.
I've done that. I've done that too. A jazz band playing in the park doesn't actually draw a huge crowd, and that's
It
probably.
draw me, by the way. That's my thing. I love jazz. But anyway, go.
Oh, well, listen, in a month's time, we can talk music, okay?
Yeah, at any time.
But the thing that people are grappling with at the moment, and sports is used as a metaphor everywhere, Bill. The thing that people are grappling with at the moment is how you pull yourself out of what is an economic funk.
Mm.
You've seen a lot of ups and downs with sporting clubs, and you've observed how people have motivated sides or individuals, depending on the sport, to get themselves up and running. What are some of the techniques that have stood out to you that those listening might pick up on and then think about it as they're grappling with how they motivate themselves again?
Well, firstly, the whole concept of motivation now is hugely complex and far more intricate than it ever was. And, I think it's the oldest thing in the book. We both know that is the corporate world seeking motivation and other sort of mechanisms and tools from the sporting world. But I think it's still relevant because there is a purity, and please bear with me on this because I know there's a lot of corruption in sport. But I mean, in the ideal of sport, there is still a lot of purity. That the idea of people actually out there in competition against one another, whether it's in a stadium or on a field or whatever, there is still a purity in that. The ideal of it is still there. That hasn't been corrupted, even though there are many other factors that corrupt it. But and getting to the motivational side of things, I think what's in place now is a much heightened sensitivity to the needs of the individual within the team. So, for example, once upon a time, and coaches still do this, they'll take their team to a movie. and there are various, usually war films when it comes to men's football teams, but there are various other films that they use. There are lots of cliched and stereotyped sort of motivational mechanisms, but now I find that coaches are now far more attentive to the individual. I know this sounds strange, but they are learning that each player has their own different motivations and requirements, particularly as we are now more sensitive to the cultural backgrounds of players. For example, and this has been a big factor in the decisions made by the NRL regarding their resumption and the bubble and all those things. The huge number of Pacific Islanders, Polynesian players in rugby league, they have a huge emphasis in their lives on family and the larger family, not the immediate family too. So that's just one of many cultural aspects that coaches have had to become more aware of over the years. And these things now are what are applied. So the good coaches are able to talk to each of the players differently, as opposed to the old style coach who basically said, this is how I talk to you, this is how I will convey my meaning, and if you don't like it, well, too bad, you'll fall through the cracks, you can go and play elsewhere or stop playing at all. That's become a far more nuanced job, and I think hats off to a lot of the successful coaches these days who are able to get people to, forgive me for the cliche, buy in. But that said, there are still a lot of the old-fashioned things. Team bonding is done. It's a lot more politically correct now. Excuse the French, but back in the old days, any rugby league coach would take their players out to get pissed, at some stage during the season, and it's still referred to in joking manner. And even now in state of origin camps or national teams, for example, there'll be the reference to, the boys are going out or the girls, whatever it is, to bond. But now, of course, there's a greater emphasis on just having a meal together or, doing something a little more sociable than getting drunk. So there are still a few old mechanisms applied, but in a different way. But I think the greatest thing now is this emphasis on the individual, which I find fascinating, because that's a lot harder to do, Tom. It's a lot harder to do for a coach. And you know what? I don't know if managers do this too well in business. If you want me to get on a soapbox for 5 minutes, actually not that long, don't worry. One thing I've experienced.
So I'm couriering the soapbox over to you now.
Here it is. Thank you. Wait a minute. Let me get up on it. There it is. Thank you. Okay. I've found this in the media industry, and I'm sure it is pervasive in business everywhere, because TV is just another form of business. I find management appallingly, particularly middle management, appallingly lazy. They are sensitive only to those people who jump up and down in front of them. In other words, they oil the squeaky wheel. That person could be hugely ambitious and a major suck-up. They could also be an angry kind of person who, complains about everything and likes to say they don't suffer fools, which is often a euphemism for just being a dickhead. Now, those sort of people get the attention of management. The good, quiet, hard-working achievers are often missed. Because why? They don't walk into the manager's office. They're too busy doing their damn job. I've been told over the years by producers, you didn't get that gig because I didn't think you wanted it. Why? Well, so-and-so raced into the office and said he wanted to do it. Well, is that the only requirement for this job? That the person who came in and asked for it gets it? What about qualifications? I find coaching now is far more sensitive to who actually has ability and who can do the job. In other words, if you're the quiet achiever in the team, you will be noticed. They go about seriously trying to recognize talent. They don't just oil the squeaky wheel. And what we have created is an entire generation of fake it till you make it people. All they're worried about is creating the pretense of achievement instead of actually achieving. That's something we can learn from sport.
You make an excellent point, and there's something else that I would like to segue to because we're seeing a lot of this discussion in the corporate sector right now, all over the place. Um, Fame can get to some people's heads.
Mm.
Okay, there's a lot of there are certain areas in business as in sport where people's self-importance seems to take over. We've seen in the past week um, the sort of revelations about the behaviour of a certain High Court judge, for example. And we know that sports clubs have that same problem.
Mm.
The disrespect that is shown by some individuals in sports clubs to women. How do you? eh, What does sport need to do? And then by corollary, it's a lesson business has got to embrace as well. What does sport need to do to sort of um, kick the pedestal from underneath the self-important people who think they can do anything?
That's a very good point. I really believe sport can lead the way in this aspect for the very reasons I've just outlined, in that I still think that the ideal of sport is an important thing. And I know that's a very subtle point because, I repeat that you can straight away bounce back at me and say, oh, for goodness sake, Woodsy, look at all the corruption in sport. However,
Look at
my
all
point,
look at all poor behaviour in politics. Look at all the poor behaviour in the law. Look at
it's
the poor
everywhere.
behaviour in some areas of the accounting world.
Yep.
Look at the poor behaviour in sort of the clerical religious circles. We can go on if you want to focus on that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I come back to the point that correct, that's human nature, sadly, but the ideal in sport is still in place. Whereas I think in a lot of other areas, the ideals have disintegrated and have been replaced by far more cynical and well, I won't say corrupt, but well, for example, the we've seen recently, and I'm getting a little bit off the topic. I will come back to what you were saying about leading the way in areas like sexism and racism. But just quickly, the whole structure of politics, for example, since the branch stacking story came out in Victoria, and I must point out that they are not alone in that practice. It just happens to be them at this time who's had the publicity. We all know that. So, how do you change the system so that it's not inherently corrupt? Because what happens is that you do after a while find that the structures themselves become inherently difficult for honest people and good people to succeed. Therefore, it must change. Like I was saying with the business practice with management, management needs to take more time to get out of their comfortable leather chairs in their office and get out in the workplace and identify the people who are actually working, and not just sit on their backsides and wait for the squawkers to come in and promote themselves. And likewise, perhaps we need to change our structures in these areas, our systems, so to speak, to try and make it easier for the good people to succeed. So getting back to your point, I think sport in that sense still has an ideal of merit. It's still fundamentally a meritocracy. Notwithstanding again some of the things I've mentioned, but the ideal is that, and I think we can. I've been a little bit disappointed. I naively thought that we're actually in a pretty good place, and I used to say on the Bill and Boz show with Mark Bosnich that I thought sport could lead the world in the sense of uniting humanity in destroying sexism and racism, which I don't think can be ever totally destroyed, but I think it can certainly be reduced.
Well, yeah, but what you're basically saying is you can't you can't completely kill an idea or kill behaviours, but what you
No.
can do is make it sufficiently unfashionable so people steer clear of wanting to be advocates for that kind of poor behaviour.
Yes, and I agree. I think even if an individual, for whatever reason, and there are a vast number of reasons why people are racist or sexist, but whatever reasons are, if you manage to even suppress it for a lengthy period of time, you can make them come around to a certain way of logical thinking, if you know what I mean. And don't. What we're finding is, unfortunately, with this opening of many doors in social media, where we're actually giving vent to people who would otherwise have suppressed these notions, and over time actually become educated and learn that they are actually inaccurate beliefs, and false beliefs, and they will ultimately express themselves the right way. But unfortunately, we're giving vent to people's raw, uneducated emotions. But on that point, I used to say to Boz, one of the great things about the sporting field is seeing a group of multicultural athletes, of all races, colours and backgrounds. And Premier League football is a great example of that. My own team, Liverpool, has an extremely diverse collection of players who've achieved a lot of great things together. To see them standing on a field, embracing and working together, and breaking down an enormous number of different barriers, religious, social, cultural, physical, then that to me is a wonderful inspiration for the rest of the world. And yet we still see increasing or a lot of evidence of racism among the fans. And I think to myself, this person is watching a fine example of humanity combining as it should for a common cause, and they still don't get it. They still want to pick on the black guy. I just find it just beggars belief, and it's greatly disappointing. And this whole argument over Heredia Lumumba's situation, and the involvement of, I don't want to pick on Collingwood because, as I said, it's another example of this club at this time going through this controversy. I'm not saying they're innocent either, by the way, but the point I'm trying to make is that it has been a bit disappointing to me lately that sport has not been the example that I thought it would be. And to hear, and I was a great supporter and still am of Adam Goodes, and it was so sad to speak to him recently. Well, when I say recently now, it's late last year. Time flies when you're locked down. But I was at a function with him and I said, mate, why don't you come on the show? And he said, mate, as long as I don't have to talk about footy, which is so sad. It's so sad that one of our great players feels that way. And it just cuts me when I hear him say that. And I think sport's still got a long way to go, obviously. There are many, many other stories. I wrote a book on Hazem El Masri, one of the great Muslim rugby league players, and he's a good mate of mine, and has told me some interesting stories. And he is one of the most open-minded, forgiving people you could ever meet. And there was a lot of casual racism, as you can imagine, when he first started playing rugby league, a sport that was totally unfamiliar with a professional Muslim player at the time, you can imagine, and has had some great stories. But I'll tell you what, his attitude is astonishing in terms of how he understands the ignorance behind the comments that he faced, and how he went about educating the people rather than confronting them. Unfortunately, I think there are certain environments, whether it's induced by the club or the coach at the time, or maybe the playing group, it's hard to say, where it's not that easy. And I think these are areas we really need to unite on. And here's another funny point. Some time ago, I can't remember which show it was, we discussed this aspect, this racism aspect on Bill and Boz, and there was initially a reluctance to discuss the concept, and the reason being was that we had no Indigenous players on the panel, or no black players on the panel that night, and we were worried about being accused of do you bring up this topic when there are no black players, and I refer to that term. It was about racism.
Yeah, but you were sitting there with a guy of Croatian descent who would have grown up the way I had, from time to time, watching soccer before he played, looking at and living in an environment where his parents and relatives and friends were essentially being discriminated against.
Yes.
Being called all sorts of things, being called terrorists, being called, I remember well somebody thinking it was funny to say, oh, you're Croatian, are you? Does that mean that you drive around with bomb parts in your boot?
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
yeah,
And there's that.
you could have gone there
Mm,
with Mark Bostic, because there's a classic example of, yes, he's white,
mm.
but think about all the other elements and cultural features that comes with um, him having the heritage that he has.
That's true, and that's certainly a valid point. But even given that the topic was particularly about people of colour,
Yeah,
I posed this though, and we restricted the discussion, and I said it on Sky News some time ago when I was asked about the Indigenous players deciding not to sing the national anthem. I said to it might have been Spearsy on Sky News at the time, um, I am not going to stand here and judge an Indigenous player on how he should uh, approach the national anthem, because I'm not in his shoes, or her shoes for that matter. And I said, so it's not fair for me to make comment on that because I have not lived their experience. And I totally agree with that position still. However, the funny part about this discussion was that you will get criticism um, for having a bunch of white guys, for example. And I know a Premier League panel was criticised for it too. But the sad part about it was they weren't trying to interpret or discuss the experience of a black player in the Premier League. What they were talking about was how the white people, the white players, could better support their teammates and what should they do to help them. For example, if a black player says, I've copped enough of this abuse, I'm walking off, the white guy should walk straight off with him. And that was the discussion. So the discussion was about what white people could do. And yet they were still criticised for not having representation on that panel. So this is how complicated and difficult these scenarios are to deal with. I firmly believe, for example, to talk about women's sport, a bunch of guys can talk about women's sport, providing they do it in the right context. But there are still people who will criticise you for not having a woman on the panel on that night. And yet the previous night, you can have 3 women on the panel talking about men's sport. No one thinks anything more about it.
This is the same discussion people have about the drum or the ABC or Q&A or panels on Sky News or whatever. If the news event happens on a particular day, do you then ring fence that and say we can't touch it because the panel we've got on tonight is composed of persons X, Y, and Z, and none of them have that background?
And I understand the viewers thinking that you can just click your fingers and get any representation, you like from anywhere in Australia at the time. And technically with Skype and all those things, it's possible, but it's not always easy. Quite often newsrooms try very hard to get a representative panel. If you can't, you then have to be just careful how you channel the discussion. And you don't try and pretend to put yourself in anyone else's shoes or speak for anyone else, but there are certainly other ways you can contribute to the conversation. So I think viewers need to be a little more open-minded. But then again, we're also in an age where the scrutiny on social media is frankly appalling, and very.
Well, I mean, your former Sky colleague and someone I've come to know well, David Spears, cops it every time there's a panel that doesn't look like what some people on Twitter want to see on a Sunday morning, and the guys who put insiders together cop it mercilessly.
And they start picking on the fact that Spearsy worked in Sky News. Just the fact that he worked there, when I can't recall, I've never seen a more, and there are plenty of them, don't get me wrong, but there are none more objective than Spearsy when it comes to politics.
Absolutely. And I know what he's like when he interviews people. He's done me, well, not quite done me over, but I've been at the other end of his questions. And I know how the mind ticks. And it's not about a gotcha moment. It's not about tripping people over. It's about holding people accountable for what they're saying.
And look, one of the fundamental problems with social media and its alleged diversity is that, unfortunately, instead of, and I love the way a lot of the so-called woke people were welcoming the social media age and the digital media age, and how it saw how they saw the destruction of what they believed was a corrupt and biased mainstream media. I love the way how they trumpeted the opening up of digital media and social media and web pages and all these other things, bloggers, as being now a representation of greater truth and honesty in reporting. And you can now go out there on the internet and you can find the truth. Well, good luck. Good luck with that exploration. You may as well try and find the proverbial needle in the haystack, because what is happening is that we are now finding that any idiot with any perverse or extreme views can find their own little tribe of perverse and extreme people on the internet somewhere, and they'll stick with that tribe. What we're seeing now, instead of a greater awakening, an opening of minds, is we're seeing polarization. We're seeing teams of bullies on one side or the other of politics, and various social views, although there's not much crossover there either, bullying people now who try to find the middle ground. The people who are moderate and reasonable and sensible are trying to please everyone, trying to find some common understanding and humanity. They are being bullied by extremists on social media. So to all those people who thought that this wonderful diversity that would be achieved and this awakening of social media, look what you've reaped.
Absolutely. It is a major issue. The last few issues we've touched really cut deeply with you, don't they?
Look, I've been in the media a long time, and I'm very aware of the biases of mainstream media. There are very many great objective commentators out there, and there are plenty of others whose columns you can pretty much write yourself, because you know their particular biases and their backgrounds. And that's okay, as long as there's a spectrum of different beliefs there, and I think there are across the various media. To those people who say, oh, you know, the Murdoch press indoctrinates everybody, I understand the biases inherent in some aspects of the Murdoch press, but they're also the Guardian, the ABC, the various other sources of news that are completely the opposite in their political views. There are plenty of options out there. If you don't, there's free media out there that you can consume that is diametrically opposed to the most high-profile Murdoch commentators or those on Sky News, if that's what you prefer. And getting back to my point, I think you should read everybody, because you'll pick up a bit of truth in all of it. But excuse me, but there's plenty of opposing opinions out there that you don't even have to pay for. So I don't understand why there's so much emphasis on the influence of the Murdoch media. But I think that we're getting into very different topics from sport here, but that assumption of the amount of control that they exercise, and I know it's powerful, don't get me wrong, but the assumption that control is so effective is actually an insult to the intelligence of the population, who are free and have access to alternative views. So I just find that, sadly, the reputation and the professionalism of the journalistic fraternity has been eroded a lot in this process of opening up to other forms of free media. There is unfortunately a sniggering assumption that most journalists now have some kind of inherent bias because of who they work for or how their particular workplaces operate. And I think that's unfair, because I've worked for a lot of different companies with a lot of different journos, and there are inherent biases, but very few of them are systemic.
And that's a good point to sort of, and I'm mindful of the time, Bill. So that's a good point to kind of wrap things up a bit. Now, you've written books, and you've got a website where people can go and see what you've done. Where can they? Can you just briefly take us through the books you've actually written over the years?
I wrote two non-fiction books, Legends of Speed, which was a story of Australia's great racing drivers. And it's actually a story, that the narrative of how they all knew each other and the evolution of Australian race drivers is quite interesting. I mean, you'd probably have to be a motorsport enthusiast to really enjoy it, but it's not too technical. And there are a lot of, it's not all talking about, pistons and fuel consumption, but there's that, and that sold very well. And also, so did the biography of Hassan El-Masri that I wrote, and his life from war-torn Lebanon back in the day, right through to the end of his career and the role he's played both socially and in the sporting world. And I wrote a fiction book and self-published it just recently, which is has the series title Trio, based on 3 young kids who get involved in a political conspiracy in Paris. So it's called The Redemption Code, and it's effectively about and those who of the extreme left or the extreme right, don't try and position me one way or the other here, because it's impossible. But this is about a conspiracy to protect the history of an extreme right-wing presidential candidate who looks like he may get across the line in the French elections. Something that actually in recent history is stacked up conceivably, and you've still got characters in Europe generally who are feeding off a lot of the unrest in the world at the moment. And I think extreme right-wing politics has had an uncomfortable rise. But the kids get caught up in a conspiracy to protect his history, and there are people operating within a sort of a French resistance, a modern French resistance, trying to bring him down. So they get caught up in the middle of it. It's quite a violent, but I think a book that might resonate with a lot of people.
Well, I might actually have a look at it myself, because I'm having cause to look at some of those issues from a master's study point of view. Bill, it's been an absolute delight talking with you today. We could go on all day, but you've got other things to do other than to whack things around the airwaves with me. Thanks for taking the trouble to have a chat.
No, it's been fun, Tom. Thank you. I hope I haven't rambled on too much.
No, you've been absolutely fine. Not a problem. And to those listeners out there, stay safe and look after each other. And you can join me again for another podcast.